Okay, it's recording. Cool. Okay, so this is Demystifying Drupal AJAX Callback Commands. A nice long title. So I like to start my sessions out by talking about what the goals are. So that way, if you don't feel like this is the session that's right for you, you have enough time to go catch another one. And it lets the latecomers come in without missing too much of what I'm going to talk about. So my first goal, I want to explain what AJAX callback commands are at a high level on the client side and on the server side. So we're going to get into it, what they are and how you use them. I'm going to demonstrate with that as a goal how to use AJAX callback commands, how you go about using them, what their purpose is, and how you implement that. And then finally outline how you can create your own AJAX callback commands. So if you don't like the ones Drupal or other Drupal modules provide, you'll know how to make your own. They're pretty simple to do. With that, before that, a little bit about myself, in case you don't know me. My name is Michael Miles. I am from Boston, Massachusetts, where I work as the Associate Director of PHP for a company called Genuine. We're a full-service digital agency. We do everything from brand engagement, SEO, UX, design, video, development. We have offices in Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and New York. Drupal development is just a small part about what Genuine does, but it's 99% about what I do every day. And I have stickers if you want stickers afterwards. I've been working with Drupal since 2008. I've done everything from theme development, content entry, to architecting and deploying large-scale global platforms for brands. I'm an Acquia Grand Master, which means I've passed 3 Acquia tests, and I was named one of the 2014 Acquia MVPs. So go me. At the hospital, they said I can't lift anything too heavy, so I had to deflate my ego a little bit for the next couple of weeks. You can find me on Twitter at MikeMiles86, or Drupal.org at MikeMiles86, or anywhere on the internet, MikeMiles86. Guess what year I was born?
83.
Close, not exactly. So if you want to find out more about me, that's how you can reach me. And finally, before we get started, I have a warning about example code. Yes, there is example code in this presentation. I've also ignored some of the Drupal coding standards for presentation purposes, so everything fits nicely on a slide. So if you're going to take my code from this presentation, put it through Coder, you're going to get errors. It's going to be valid, but it's not going to look the best. And then finally, Drupal 8 code that I show you is still subject to change, as Drupal 8 is not released yet. However, Drupal 8 is pretty good now, so we shouldn't have any messes on our hands with the code I show you. See what I said about the GIFs with the lights turned off? They're much better. So let's get into it. What commands are? This first part of the presentation, I want to explain to you what the commands are from a high level and how Drupal uses them, and then how you can go about using them. Or that's the next section. I'm going to explain callback commands both on the client side, and explain the code that makes up command on the client side, and explain what makes up a command on the server side. If we start at a high level, callback command is just the response that comes back from any AJAX request. So in Drupal, starting in Drupal 7, we have what's known as the AJAX framework. Before that, we had something called the AHA framework, which was kind of AJAX. The AJAX framework handles all AJAX requests in a Drupal site, from Drupal 7, Drupal 8, and probably Drupal 9. I don't see it going anywhere. Any request that's made with the AJAX framework is basically making a request from the client to the server. The server is building an array or a JSON object of commands that's sending back to the client side, and those commands are then running JavaScript functions. So you can think of a callback command as PHP code that instructs JavaScript functionality. On the JavaScript side, a callback command is a function that's attached to a global object, and we'll get into what that object is in a little bit. This object just has a bunch of functions attached to it, and the PHP code just tells the client what functions to run. And finally, callback commands are defined by either Drupal core or by Drupal modules. In Drupal 7, Drupal core comes with 17 callback commands. I'm not going to go through all of them. That would be a waste of our time. I will show you 1 or 2. There's a lot of great documentation on what callback commands are available. They're very basic things. A lot of them just mirror or wrap what jQuery does. So let's take an example. Let's look at an example of one of the core commands. We have the remove command. Let me zoom in to this. So this is using the examples module, which you can download on Drupal.org. It lists out examples for all of Drupal's core functionality. And here we're doing an example of the remove command. So there's a checkbox and text. When you click that checkbox, Drupal makes an AJAX request. The request sends back a response for a command saying use the remove command, and it removes the text from the browser. Pretty basic example. Let's see what's going on under the hood of this. On the client side, the remove command is a function that's attached to Drupal.ajax.prototype.commands object. It's a JavaScript object. All functions that attach to this object receive 3 arguments. AJAX, which has information about the request that's being made, the callback path that's being accessed, what event triggered the event, what element triggered the AJAX event. Response, which contains any data that's sent back from the server in the response object. So this may be the information you need to know what to manipulate. And then a status argument, which is just the status of the request. So 400 error, or 404 error, 500, or 200, hopefully a 200. These 3 arguments are part of every function that's attached to this object. And all these commands are on the client side are wrappers for additional JavaScript functionality. So if we take a look at the core remove command provided by Drupal, we see that on line 2, this is in ajax.js provided by Drupal core. It has the global object that it creates, and one of the methods or functions it has is the remove function. Receives our 3 arguments, AJAX, response, and status. And as we can see in lines 8 through 11, all it's doing is basically, well, on line 10, it's just doing the jQuery remove command. And it does some cleanup code, like detaches behaviors from this selector. So it's a wrapper, a basic wrapper for more complex JavaScript. Now on the server side, in Drupal 7, what an AJAX callback command is, all it is a PHP function which returns an associative array. That's it. It's a very simple thing. And all that array needs to have is a single element in it that has the key of command. And the value of this element in this array is the name of the JavaScript function that it wants to run on the client side. Any additional array elements that are passed with this associative array are treated as the response data that's sent in the response object. So if we take a look at the remove command provided by Drupal core in Drupal 7, it's this function here that's provided in ajax.inc in the includes folder. The function's called ajax command remove. It takes the argument of a CSS selector, which is it's just a string. And all it returns is this really basic associative array. The first element is command, and the name is remove, which is the name of that function attached to the JavaScript object. And it passes a selector as the second argument. So if I go back to our JavaScript, our remove function, we see that on line 10, it's using response.selector. That's the data that's sent back from this call. And the function is called remove. So it's how they marry each other. That's it. That's all that a command is. I could probably just drop the mic and go now. It's on the JavaScript side, it's a function that wraps other JavaScript attached to a global object. And on the server side, it's a PHP function that returns an associative array that has to have the key of command with the value of the name of a function attached to that JavaScript object. It's great to know. So how do we use these commands? So in this section, I want to talk about an example scenario. My notes say X maple scenario. Example scenario for using an AJAX callback commands. And we're going to go through the process of building out that code and show how we would use the core commands to do it. So I have a sort of user story I've written for this presentation. I'll read it out loud. It says, as a user, when I navigate to the My Messages page, and I see a list of my unread messages, and I see a list of my read messages. When I click on an unread message, then the full message is retrieved from the server, and I see the content of my message. And the message is removed from the unread messages list, and it's placed in the read messages list. So this is the functionality we're going to get to with my website that's going to win the Blue Drop Awards this year. I have this left-hand column with unread messages, the titles of which are links. When I click it, an AJAX request is made, populates the middle column with the title and the content. It moves the title from the unread messages to the read messages. So this is being done using AJAX commands, and we're going to go through how I set this up. So to use AJAX commands, there are just 3 steps you need to follow. The first of which is to make sure you include the Drupal AJAX library on your page that needs to make AJAX requests. There's no AJAX JavaScript library. Drupal's not going to know how to make AJAX requests. Excuse me. The second thing you need to do is make sure you attach AJAX to page elements. So you need something that triggers an AJAX event. I'm not going to go in too much detail on how to do this with this presentation. And that's a presentation in of itself, but there's a lot of great documentation online on how to do that. And then step 3, you have to define a callback path and a callback function. So this is the path that the AJAX event calls on the server side, and then the function that returns an array of the commands that should be run on the client. So that's what it has to return, is a render array of commands in Drupal 7. So I have everyone's favorite module here, my module. And this is the .module file. And I have a function here that's called message page. And this is the function that is responsible for printing out that page we saw in the example. The things that are to pay attention to in this code example, because I know there's a lot of code here, is line 4. I'm doing Drupal add library to add the Drupal AJAX library. So Drupal knows to include JavaScript, or the AJAX library, sorry. Have that taken care of. The rest of this code here just builds my lists and builds my empty div and builds my list of red messages. I also have to define a callback path. So I have here, I have to attach AJAX to page elements. And I have a function here that's building my UL list of messages. And on line 6, I'm building a link element. And what's important is 2 things. I have the callback path, which for me is read message callback / Node.js / the ID of the message. And then I'm attaching attributes to my link with a specific class called useAJAX. So the AJAX library provided by Drupal, when it loads on a page, it's going to look for any links for links, it's going to look for any links that have the class useAJAX. And it's going to know that when a user clicks on that link, not to make a regular page request, but to make an AJAX request instead. The Node.js part, I'm going to talk about in a second. This is part of graceful degradation. Did I say that right? Yeah. All right, thank you. And what will happen, and we'll see this in our next part of defining a callback path, step 3, is I have 2 menu paths I'm providing in my module. The first one is read message callback Node.js and read message callback AJAX. So when the AJAX library sees my links have the use AJAX class, when it goes to make an AJAX request, it's going to replace automatically Node.js with AJAX. So the purpose of this is that if, for whatever reason, AJAX is not running on my page, I have to have a fallback that the user can get to without JavaScript. So hence the Node.js. These menu callbacks are pretty much the same. I'm inheriting everything. I'm setting a callback function, passing page arguments. And for my AJAX path, I am changing the delivery to be an AJAX delivery. And this is going to tell Drupal to render what I'm sending to it as a JSON array of commands to send to the client. And then finally, step 3b, I have to return an array of commands using a render array. So here I have my callback function, my module read message callback, which I've defined in my menu path here, read message callback. So in this function, I am getting my message with the argument that's passed, and then I'm building an associative array of commands on line 5 through 14. And I'm just using the core commands provided by Drupal. So first thing I'm doing is I'm calling AJAX command HTML, passing it a selector and the message subject, AJAX command HTML to pass the message content. I'm calling the remove command, which we looked into, which we know will remove something from the page, passing it the selector, and then an append command to append a list item to my red messages list. And I return this as a render array of type AJAX, and on line 18, I'm passing my array of commands. So returning this render array using AJAX, AJAX callback, yeah, AJAX delivery. Drupal's going to know to turn this array here of commands into a JSON object to send to the client. Really simple to do. That's it. It's pretty basic. So 3 steps: include the JavaScript library, AJAX library on your page, have something that triggers AJAX on your client side, have a path for the AJAX to reach, and then have a callback function which builds an associative array, or sorry, not associative array, a render array of commands using the core commands, or what we'll see in the future, custom commands. Does that make sense to everybody? Pretty basic? Yeah?
Go back to that last slide.
This one, yeah.
So the AJAX command HTML,
Yeah.
that's taking the key and the value there, the selector and the content.
Yep.
And then it's maybe returning some other array.
Yeah, so this command, so if you remember when we looked at the remove command, how it takes the selector and it builds an associative array that says command remove, selector equals selector. In command HTML, it receives selector and then content, and then it says command HTML, selector is this, content is this. Yeah, so the core commands are great. Let's talk about creating some custom commands. Maybe you want to do something that Drupal core or modules don't provide you. To create commands, 2 steps. That's all you need to do to create your own commands in Drupal. Step 1, you need to add a function to the Drupal AJAX command JavaScript object. So we looked at before that the remove command is part of that global commands object. You have to add your own JavaScript function to that object. And on the server side, you have to write PHP code that returns an associative array. What does that associative array have to return? Anybody? You're close. It has to have an element with the key of command, the value of which is the name of the JavaScript function you want to call on the client side. And then any additional elements you want to pass to your custom JavaScript. But all you need is that one key of command. That's it. That's all you have to do is those 2 steps. Attach a function to a global object, return an associative array on the PHP side in a function.
And depending on the custom, what you're building, it may have a selector, it may have other options.
Yep, and so that's why you can pass whatever else you want in that array. Yep. Yeah, you can pass whatever you want. You can just pass the command and have JavaScript know to do everything already. Yep. So let's look at building a custom command in Drupal 7. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add a function to the Drupal.ajax.prototype.commands object. Then we're going to define a PHP function to return the associative array. So we go back to my module. I create a JavaScript file called command.js or commands.js, and I just attach to the Drupal AJAX prototype commands object a function called readMessage. Receives my 3 arguments that all functions attached to this object receive, AJAX response and status. And then I'm doing basically what I was doing with commands before. I'm just doing it on the JavaScript side already. Line 5, I'm calling the jQuery.html command, passing the subject, HTML command, passing the content, calling the jQuery remove command on my list or for my message, and calling the append command on my messages list to add the subject. So I've taken what I was doing with the core commands on the server side and now just doing them straight up in jQuery. And on the PHP side of my custom command, I create a function called myModule command read message. And all I'm returning is an associative array. I have the command read message, which is the same name as the JavaScript function I attached to that global object. I pass the message ID for the message object I have, the subject of that message, and the content. So these additional elements here are going to be part of the response object, which we see here. Response subject, response content, response MID, and read message is the command. Read message. Now, when using a command, 2 steps you have to do to use a custom command. 1, you have to tell Drupal to include your custom JavaScript on the page. And step 2, you have to make sure your custom command is being used in some sort of callback function. If it's not being used and it's not on the page, Drupal's not going to use it. That's it. Those are the 2 things you have to do. So using a custom command in Drupal 7, step 1, use something like Drupal add.js to include your custom JavaScript on the page that needs AJAX events. In step 2, add your command to the render array being returned by your callback function. So we go back to my module, .module. We have that messages page function. Before that, I've commented out, is just building that basic page. We saw earlier on, I was making sure to include the Drupal AJAX library on line 4. And now on line 6, I'm making sure to include my custom JavaScript as well, so that it will attach to the AJAX object, the commands object. Then on my callback function, which before I was using those 4 core commands, and I was building this big array of the core commands to use, like AJAX HTML, AJAX remove. Instead, I'm just calling my custom command, my module command read message, and passing my message object, and returning that render array for Drupal to turn into JSON. Pretty cool, huh? That's pretty easy to use. So I've replaced the core commands that I was using with my custom command, and I've moved all that functionality over to the JavaScript side. I could do a lot more complex stuff if I wanted to, but for this example, it's pretty basic. So on the JavaScript side, I could have done whatever I wanted and completely messed with the page, called APIs, or in my callback function, I could call, or my command function, I could call APIs before I build that array to return. All right, so I want to take a look at AJAX commands in Drupal 8. Everybody loves Drupal 8. A few changes to the AJAX functionality and AJAX commands in Drupal 8, but not many. First off, there are now 22 AJAX callback commands in Drupal 8 core instead of 17. This is mainly because Drupal 8's pulled in some of those modules that provided other callbacks like views, CTools. Did it pull in CTools? Yeah, I think CTools. And it just has some additional commands. The JavaScript object, which commands are attached to, including any custom commands you write, are changed. It's now called Drupal.ajaxcommands.prototype.object. And instead of writing a on the client server side, instead of commands being functions, they're now PHP objects that implement command interface. So interfaces are a bit of object-oriented programming from Symfony 2, well, not from Symfony 2, but because of Symfony 2, we have object-oriented programming in Drupal 8. In interfaces, if you're a little fuzzy on what an interface is, it's basically a contract for code. So you're saying if you have an object that implements an interface, it's guaranteeing it has certain methods and functions defined in it. For callback commands, they have to implement the render method, which all that's going to do is return an associative array that has to have key of command and the value of a JavaScript function. So we go back, if we remember our good friend, the remove command in Drupal 8, same thing. I guess is a Drupal 7 screenshot, but it's the same thing. Click a checkbox, makes an AJAX request, returns back saying, remove this selector from the page, the item gets removed. So if we look at this from the Drupal 8 perspective, it's a JavaScript function attached to Drupal.ajaxcommands.prototype. And here's our remove function provided by Drupal 8 core. Again, it's the remove function, same 3 arguments that got in Drupal 7, AJAX response and status. And then at line 10 through 13, it's just, again, wrapping some additional JavaScript. And ultimately, it's just a wrapper for a jQuery function. Just a cleaner way to do it. And now on the PHP side for callback commands, again, they're objects that implement the command interface. They must implement the render method. And what that looks like is this. This is the remove command provided by Drupal 8 core, located in lib Drupal core ajax remove command.php. It's a PHP class, implements command interface, which means it guarantees it has a render method. And all this method is returning this basic array, the same array it was returning in Drupal 7 as a function. So it's just object-oriented wrapper around the function from Drupal 7. So to use commands in Drupal 8, again, just 3 steps to use AJAX callback commands. Step 1, make sure you include the AJAX JavaScript library on the page that needs AJAX functionality. However, in Drupal 8, you have to attach the library to a render array. I'll explain that in a moment. Make sure you have AJAX attached to some page elements so that it causes an AJAX event to occur. And then define a callback path and function like you would in Drupal 7, except your function doesn't return a render array of commands. It has to return an AJAX response object, which again is a PHP class that returns of response. So we have our example again here where we're adding messages, retrieving messages from the server and displaying them on the page using AJAX. So my module is now a Drupal 8 module. I'm not going to go into everything you need for writing a module in Drupal 8. However, we have a controller which defines a function to print out the object of our page, a render array. So I'm just building a page object with content, type markup. I made this didn't used to be real Drupal 8 code, but then I gave this presentation and Krell saw it and he yelled at me, so I fixed it to be Drupal 8. Well, he asked a question. He didn't yell at me. But on line 15, I have to attach my JavaScript library. Did I skip my job? Yeah. I had to include the JavaScript library to the render array. So pages has attached library, which is an array itself, and I just give it the name of what library to include. In this case, it's Drupal.ajax. Drupal renders this page, pulls in the library, builds the page that we saw. And then I also have a callback function. I'm not going to go into the roots or routes and how you set those up. But when an AJAX request gets made, it hits my callback function that's now Drupal 8. And I'm building a response object here. AJAX response. I just call AJAX response, and I'm calling the method add command, and I'm adding the AJAX commands provided by Drupal core. This is very similar on line 10 through 19 of what we did in Drupal 7, where instead Drupal 7 we built an array. Here we're just adding objects to a class. So I'm calling HTML command, the remove command, and the append command, which themselves are now objects. Creating custom commands in Drupal 8. Again, it's very basic, just like in Drupal 7. It's 2 steps. Step 1, add a function to Drupal.ajaxcommands.prototype JavaScript object. And then step 2, define your own command object that implements command interface. So here I have my module JS commands.js. I've attached my read message command to the JavaScript object, and it's the same exact JavaScript code I did for the Drupal 7 example. I don't have to change this. It's jQuery. It doesn't matter. I just changed the object that's attached to. And then I define my own object that implements command interface. So here I have a file called readMessageCommand.php. I implement the command interface, which means I have to have the method render. And all my method does is returns an associative array, key of command, and read message, and then any data I want to send in the response. Lines 11 through 18 is the function I had in my Drupal 7 example. Now it's just wrapped in some object-oriented code. Very basic. Very easy to do. So to use a custom command in Drupal 8, 3 steps to follow to use a custom command in Drupal 8 instead of 2 in Drupal 7. First step, you have to tell Drupal about your custom JavaScript library so Drupal knows your JavaScript exists. Step 2, you have to attach your library to a render array so your custom JavaScript's added to the page that needs the functionality. And step 3, you have to make sure your command, you've added your custom command to an AJAX response object in some sort of callback function, that it's being used. If it's not being used, your functionality is not going to be executed. So the way we tell Drupal in Drupal 8 to add custom JavaScript to a page is to first define it with a libraries.yaml file. This is just a structured file which tells Drupal, hey, this JavaScript library exists and here's information about it. I don't know all the information that goes into a libraries file, but I'm going to tell you a little bit what I do know. You give your libraries, it's called a library asset name. It's just like a unique name. So I call mine my_module.commands. You tell it where the JavaScript actually lives in relation to your module or if it's external JavaScript file. So I say the JS lives at js/commands.js. And then what's really cool is you can tell Drupal any dependencies your library has. So on line 5 and 6, I'm saying my commands library depends on the Drupal.ajax library. So anytime Drupal is going to include my custom JavaScript on the page, it's automatically going to know it has to include the AJAX library as well and include that, which is really cool. It's one less step I have to do. So I let Drupal know about my library. Then I have to attach it to a render array like I have to do for any JavaScript functionality. So I have replaced on line 15, before I was including the Drupal.ajax library. Now I'm adding my custom one, my module.commands. And Drupal's already going to know from my library definition to include the AJAX library. And then I add a command, my custom command, to a response object in my callback function. So I have my same AJAX response, my same callback function, but instead of doing those 4 core commands, I'm just adding my new read message command and passing my message object. So again, I'm just, in our example, I'm taking the core server-side code and I'm moving it straight over to JavaScript. Zynga, that's all you have to do. I think it's really simple. So I threw a lot at your faces, so let's review. AJAX callback commands, what are they? They're what are returned by all AJAX framework requests. So anytime an AJAX request is made in Drupal, it's expecting the return of commands. Even if you're just updating a form, that form is going to go through other functions that's going to return an array of commands. Callback commands are just PHP abstractions for JavaScript functions. It's a way for the PHP to tell the client what JavaScript functions to execute. And then callback commands are defined either by Drupal core or by Drupal modules. You can define your own. To use AJAX callback commands, you have to first make sure you include the AJAX JavaScript library on the page. And with Drupal 8, you may have to do this attaching it to a render array. You have to make sure to have AJAX attached to page elements that cause AJAX events to occur. And then you have to make sure you have a server-side callback path and function that returns an array of commands, or in terms of Drupal 8, response object that has commands attached to it. To create custom AJAX commands, you have to add a function to that global Drupal JavaScript object, whichever one, depending if you're using Drupal 7 or Drupal 8. Then you have to make sure you have PHP code, which returns an associative array that has to have the key of command that has the value of the name of your JavaScript function. Then to use custom AJAX commands, you want to make sure your custom JavaScript is included on the page. In case of Drupal 8, make sure that Drupal knows about your custom library as well. And then include custom commands in a callback function. So make sure your custom command is being used. It's not being, I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be used, but you want it to be used. And that's everything we went over. That's everything I talked to you guys about. So I have some resources because I did talk about a lot as basic stuff, so it can be kind of, you can kind of gloss over it and forget a lot about it. I have a link here for the Drupal AJAX framework, which is the documentation on the AJAX framework for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. I'm going to list these links. I'm going to come back to this slide as well, so don't worry about quickly getting them all. You can view this presentation, an annotated version of this presentation, at the bit.ly link nerd15 AJAX. You can see these presentation slides on SlideShare at nerd15 AJAX slides. All the example code that I have written for the Drupal 7 example, I have on a GitHub repository, fully baked out, fully commented, meets coding standards. So you can check that out at nerd15 AJAX EX. And then I have a blog post I wrote about creating your own custom commands in Drupal 8 that you can read about to get more information. So I'll come back to this slide in a second. I want to say sessions for me are always a work in progress. So if you have any feedback, what you thought was well, what you thought wasn't that great, let me know, hit me up, tweet at me, meet me in the hall. And I want to say thank you for attending my session. If you have any questions, we do have some time for them. So I'll be happy to answer what I can. And I'll put back up the resources slide. So that's it. Questions? Yes?
What's the advantage of using the Drupal AJAX callback object than just doing it like in jQuery? Yeah.
So the advantage, what is the advantage of using the callback commands instead of just writing jQuery to do this stuff yourself? Right. The advantage is an example of the remove command, really good example. If you were just going to do jQuery.remove, there may be behaviors that Drupal's attached to that, and you're not correctly removing those behaviors. But if you're using the callback command, Drupal is wrapping that additional JavaScript to make sure it does additional cleanup. So there may be additional functionality going on under the hood to make sure everything is honky-dory, where you're just kind of doing it rough and tumble. That's not always the case. There are plenty of cases where you could just use jQuery to manipulate data. It's also really good if you want to make sure you can do some server-side manipulation, but you don't want to have to make a bunch of calls or handle the data yourself. You just want to replace, have a link make a call to retrieve information, and then just tell on the server side, hey, just append this to a certain element. I'd say that's why you would do it.
So in Drupal 8, we have a backbone now. And so like an alternative way that I can think of thinking about like what is the advantage of this way, just think about like the other way that you would do it. In Drupal 8, you'd have like a backbone view, and that markup would be in that backbone view. That view would know about events on the elements inside of the view, and it would map specific functions to the events on those things. And so the difference between like that and this is that means that you're putting your business logic on the client side. And this allows you to put the business logic on the back end. That is important in some applications where you have changing conditions. Some data might change, some conditions might change, some permissions might move. And so it allows you to essentially have, move your logic to the server side where you may have more context, you may have more information.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
I also think about how it also seems to have advantages of like if you're working on a team and they're more comfortable writing like lots of logic in PHP, then this is a way to be able to have your business logic in PHP, but still be able to manipulate JavaScript on the front end in an AJAX way. I had a question on the, is there a typical way to bind events handlers that bind back to the AJAX commands on the client side? So like when you're generating markup,
yep.
And I'm sure it was up here, I just missed that part. But when you're generating the markup, you want to be able to say like, okay, in my business logic on the client side, I want to make sure that when this markup goes up there, that when some interaction happens with it, either a click or a hover or whatever, that it checks back with me, and so that I can tell it what behavior to perform.
So the question is, how do you get it so when like an AJAX event happens, it goes to you first, and then you can decide which callback command you want to run?
But most importantly, like I think typically, like going back to that idea that like this is a way to keep your business logic on the server side.
Yep.
You may, when you're generating markup, you may want to decide like, okay, this time this is going to need to have this behavior, this piece of markup, but it should check back with me first. And so, is there like, it's just pretty much like a question of to simplify the question, it's what are the best practices for binding the event handlers to the markup that you're sending the browser?
What? I'm not sure I follow 100%.
It was actually go back 2 slides.
Let's see, 2 slides. Oh, I could have just gone back 2 slides. In Drupal 8?
It's a couple more slides. Oh no, it was that's the sections, right?
Yeah, these are the sections. Yeah.
It was when you're reviewing. What I'm asking is actually in one of these.
All right, let me go into one of them and we'll go through it.
Yeah.
Past this?
It was near the end. Is this beginning?
This one, and so maybe this one, attach AJAX to page elements.
Yeah.
So, all right, restate your question one more time.
So, on the server side, I'm rendering a page in my page call.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have to generate some markup.
Yep.
And I want to make sure that when to bind an event, a click or a hover or whatever, to an element that will trigger an AJAX call back to one of my custom handlers, and decide whether or not it should perform an event.
Okay.
perform an action or perform a command, excuse me.
So on the server side, you probably wouldn't do that. I understand your question is because you want to keep like business logic on the server side. Attaching AJAX to page elements, there's a lot of documentation on it. And there are certain ways you can control it on the server side. For example, of links, where you add that certain class to a link. With like form elements, you also, the examples that's everywhere on the internet is forms, and I hate that that's the majority of the examples. But you attach AJAX attribute to the render array, the render object. So that's a way to control it, I guess, on the server side, where you could say, on the server side, you're doing logic to be like, all right, I do want AJAX events attached to this object. I'm going to attach an AJAX attribute that provides information about what callback to make and what method to make the AJAX request, and then what target element to change. So you can do that. Yeah, I would say that's the method I know the most about. There's a lot of documentation on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of.
More or less.
Yeah, there's no like one way.
No, there's no one way.
There's definitely no one way.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe there was like, this is the really handy way.
Yeah,
this is like the way that Drupal 8 is maybe doing it mostly.
With Drupal 8, I don't know as much about attaching JavaScript AJAX events to elements in Drupal 8, to be honest, but there is no magic bullet way to do it. There's no best practice. It all depends on what you're trying to render and what you're trying to manipulate. If it's a link, if it's a form, if it's some other render element, what it accepts and how Drupal accepts having AJAX attached to it. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you okay, and do you want an opportunity to tell us what happened?
Sure. Before I answer that question, are there any other questions? And I'll stop the recording so I don't. No? All right. Let me do this. I'll leave the viewers at home in mystery.